Thank you so much, Heather. One of the radio stations that I listen to regularly is one many of you may be familiar with. It's BBN, stands for the Bible Broadcasting Network. It comes on 93.5 on your FM dial. I've listened to BBN for a long time. It's about 50% music, about 50% preaching. I'll be honest with you, the music is sung by only those who are already in the Lord's presence. Most of the music is recorded, I believe, on 78s. But anyway, that's what I listen to it a lot. That being said, there are some times that I know I don't want to listen to BBN. In fact, there is one primary time I do not want to listen to BBN, and that's around 1:15 during the week in the afternoons. Right after lunch, it's the family altar. If any of you have listened, maybe you know of what I speak. Anyway, how it works is this. The announcer introduces someone who has recorded a devotion, so there's a brief devotion, maybe 5 minutes or so. And then for the next period of time, I'm actually not sure how long it lasts, but for the next while, you'll have an announcer reading prayer requests. But the announcers on BBN are, I don't know, I wouldn't say conversational in tone. It's very, very, very smooth. And so the requests will sound something like this. Pray for a listener who's feeling poorly today. And there's soft music playing in the background. Pray for a man whose wife is battling cancer. Another 15 or 20 seconds. Pray for a teenager who's having to make a decision. And it's just stuff that people have emailed, called in, got their name on a prayer list. And so for, 20 or 30 minutes or so, you've got an announcer. We're talking about like this, with some soft music, giving about 20 seconds to pray in between the requests. It's actually kind of fun. You ought to try talking like that. Anyway, the reason I quit listening to that is not only because most of the time when I listen to BBN, I'm in the car, and hearing someone talk about like this makes you very, very sleepy. And if you get sleepy while driving, you'll have a wreck. And someone will call in and say, pray for my pastor. Yes. Who's in the hospital after sleeping through family altar. Anyway, that's not why I don't listen. I don't listen because I got really, really, really frustrated with that several years ago. I was listening, and I promise you, I'm not exaggerating, I'm not making this up. Pray for a listener who's hosting a housewarming party on Saturday. Pray for good weather. In case you didn't understand that, pray for a woman who's having a housewarming party on Saturday. Pray for good weather. What? What? We're going to share prayer requests and all these strangers, and truly you're hearing some requests that you're thinking, I'm so grateful that I'm not going through that. Yeah, I'm glad to pray for somebody going through whatever some of these circumstances are, because you're just so plain grateful you're not having to deal with that those aren't the cards stretched out before you. But pray for a woman who's having a housewarming party. Pray that God will bless them with good weather. What? All she's wanting is good weather so that more people show up, so that she gets more stuff, right? Or maybe because it's a new house, she wants good weather so that people's feet aren't muddy and they don't track mud into her new house. Either way, you know what I'm thinking? I don't care. I could not care less. In fact, I am so agitated by this, I'm kind of praying for... Pray for someone who's praying for rain. But at the end of the day, I just simply do not care. I don't care if there's one person at our housewarming party. I don't care if there's a million people there. I just don't care. And probably anybody listening that day apart from her felt the same way. All right? No big deal, right? Doesn't make any difference if I don't care about that. I mean, Duke is playing Kansas this afternoon. I couldn't care less about that. I don't care if GTCC makes a late entry and somehow GTCC wins the NCAA tournament by some, I have no idea. Anyway, what I'm saying is I could not care less, but that's okay. Whether you care about that, whether you don't care, it's not like that's going to cause any problems. The police aren't going to show up at my house today saying, what's the matter that you do not care who wins the Duke-Kansas game? That's not a problem. There are lots of things that we don't care about or we cannot care about where it doesn't really matter. But there are some things that if we don't care about, that poses a problem. For example, if I don't care about my children, that causes a problem. That would cause a problem with you. You would say, Michael, what's the matter with you? Why aren't you taking care of your own kids? What's the matter with you? If I didn't care, it could result potentially in legal or actually criminal problems. Not simply the Department of Social Services and Child Welfare showing up, potentially even the police if I don't care. There are some things in life that you caring about them really, really matters. We're going to be thinking about something today in that vein that you'd probably say, I hope that really matters. Certainly it matters to me. We've been working our way through a series that I've called I Was Wondering, and we're looking at instances where people were asking Jesus a question. And we're doing that for a couple of reasons. One, because primarily, many of the same questions that people asked of Jesus then, in fact, in one form or another, all those same questions people are asking today. But not simply because the questions were asked, but primarily because we get a response from Jesus that speaks to us and speaks to our circumstance. And truly, the question we're going to think about today is one that at various points in life, if you haven't asked it, you'll be, at the very least, tempted to ask it. So what's the question? Look with me in your Bibles to Mark chapter 4. Mark chapter 4, we're going to start reading with verse 35. If it helps. Mark chapter 4, starting with verse 35. Mark 4, verse 35. What we'll do is read it, think about the context, and then say, well, there's the question, what does that have to do with me? Very simple approach. Verse 35, on that day when evening had come, Jesus told his disciples, let's cross over to the other side of the sea. So they left the crowd and took him along since he was in the boat. And other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking over the boat so that the boat was already being swamped. He was in the stern, sleeping on the cushion. So they woke him up and said to him, Teacher, don't you care that we're going to die? He got up, rebuked the wind and the sea, and said to the sea, Silence, be still. The wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And then Jesus said to them, Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? And they were terrified, and they asked one another, Who then is this? Even the wind and sea obey him. The question specifically asked is this. Verse 38, Teacher, don't you care that we're going to die? That question, more broadly stated, is this. In fact, I still think it to be accurate in terms of what they were communicating to Jesus. And this is a question that you may very well have said, or at some point may be tempted to ask towards the Lord, which is this. Jesus, don't you care? What I am going through right now, it is so traumatic, it is so fearful, it is so unnerving, it is so all of these things. Don't you care? Is that not ultimately their question there? Hey, Jesus, what we're going through, don't you care? Well, what is it they were going through? Well, let's think in terms of broader context. Look how chapter 4 begins. It begins with a series of parables. And what are parables? At the end of the day, they're really just kind of illustrations. They're using, in fact, as a child, I remember hearing my Sunday school teacher say that a parable is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. But that sounds really spiritual. It's an illustration. And it's an illustration where Jesus would use ordinary things in life to communicate spiritual truth. I try to do that when I'm illustrating a point in a message, right? So Jesus is using a number of stories, and he starts in chapter 4 with this parable of the sower and describing about how a sower goes out and likens faith to seed that is, or to the gospel to seed that is sown, and then that it is received in the hearts of people and potentially can grow and mature. All right, then there's the parable of the sower that's explained in verse 13. In verse 21, he starts by talking to describing a parable, likening our faith to a lamp, like to a candle. You don't put under a basket, you don't put under a bushel, you put it in a place of prominence so that it can affect and drive out darkness. He likens the kingdom of God to a seed. In fact, then in verse 30, he likens it to a mustard seed. All right, so having done all of that, verse 35 says, on that day. So on the day that Jesus is telling all of these stories, it seems that day is ended, and we're told evening had come. Now you've got to think, it's probably not pitch black. It's getting dark. Maybe the sun is going down. Maybe as they begin this process, it's working towards dusk. But nevertheless, Jesus says to his disciples, hey guys, let's get in the boat and let's go to the other side. Well, the other side of what? Well, the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Most of the time when we hear the word sea, we think like big saltwater body, right? But the Sea of Galilee is actually not an ocean. It's an enormous freshwater lake. It's 7 miles wide, 13 miles long. The Jordan River flows in one end, and then from the south it flows into the Dead Sea. So 7 by 13, this is still not a small body of water. One of the challenges, though, is that the Sea of Galilee is surrounded by cliffs and mountains. And if you've ever been in a downtown area with huge skyscrapers, what is one of the things that you'll experience as you walk around these big, enormous structures? There's a lot of wind occurring as all these currents of air are moving about. The same is true when you've got big mountains and cliffs with a low body of water. There's all this wind that is prone to begin to gust, oftentimes out of nowhere. Such was the case here in this passage. In fact, back in 1992, there was a storm that seemingly came out of nowhere where, and again, this is a freshwater lake, essentially. A big lake, but essentially a lake. In 1992, swells of waves were recorded over 10 feet that actually flooded the city of Tiberias. So that what we're reading here is not like kind of being out on a pontoon and it gets kind of crazy. What is described here is a fearful, very much frightful, very much life-threatening storm. But it seems as though that when the whole process begins, when Jesus invites the disciples, hey guys, let's go to the other side, there's not a cloud in the sky. Everything seems to be clear. And the fact that they're going to travel across the Sea of Galilee at night suggests they're going to be doing this in the dark, and the only way you would do that is if you could navigate with a star so that you could tell which way you're actually going. Again, that further suggests this was a clear night. Seas were calm, all is smooth. The disciples, Jesus, they get into the boat. We're told there were other boats, but as the story unfolds, they are not mentioned again. But they are on this boat, and then verse 37 says a great windstorm arose. So this comes out of nowhere. This was not on the horizon. In fact, if something like this had been the case, you've got to think they would have said, hey, we'll just stay here and let the storm pass and try this again tomorrow. Nevertheless, they're out on the boat when this storm begins. Waves are breaking over the boat. So it starts off, and the wind starts to pick up. And the waves are getting a bit bigger, and a bit bigger, and a bit bigger, so that finally the water is starting to come into the boat. Now, getting some water in a boat is not that big of a deal, but getting unrelenting water in a boat is a really big deal. And so waves keep crashing over into the boat. And so what's going to be going on? Well, we're told that the boat was being swamped. You've got to think the disciples are doing everything they can at this point. If they've got buckets or pails, they're trying to scoop. If they can't, they're just taking their hands, anything they possibly can. If there's a cup, anything to try to bail water out because more water keeps pouring in. While that is going on, we're told in verse 38 that Jesus was in the stern. Perhaps it seems that this is a covered portion of the boat up towards the front, and Jesus is on a cushion, and he is dead to the world. He is sound asleep. And so the disciples come to him, and we're told that they woke him up, and they say, "Teacher," and here's the question, "don't you care that we're about to die?" Jesus, we are going through this circumstance. Don't you care? Now, I'm not suggesting that at some point in the future you're going to be on a boat somewhere that begins to take on water to the point that you begin to cry out to the Lord in a plea of desperation. I'm not suggesting that that's going to happen, but I am suggesting this, that if you live long enough, it's almost certain that you are going to experience some circumstances that are going to feel very similar, where your back is absolutely going to be against the wall, and it's going to feel as though the walls are closing in, and you're not going to know what to do. You're going to be fearful, you're going to be uncertain, you're going to just kind of be at your wits' end, and very much the temptation when you've experienced that is going to be to look towards heaven and say, "Hey, Lord, do you not care about what I'm going through?" Now, it doesn't make any difference whether the Lord cares about the Duke basketball game today, does it? It doesn't make any difference whether the Lord cares whether it rains for a housewarming shower, but I hope it matters to the Lord what I'm going through. I hope I matter to Him, don't you? And when we are tempted or when we express that question, "Lord, don't you care?" are we not then saying, "Hey, don't you care, not simply about my circumstances, but don't you care about me?" At the end of the day, that's kind of the question, that's the root of the question that the disciples are posing to Jesus. "Jesus, these circumstances are such, you're doing nothing except for sleeping. Don't you care about us?" In fact, notice they said, "Don't you care we're about to die?" You know, if we don't make it, "Jesus, what will you do tomorrow when there's no us? Don't we matter to you?" In all likelihood, you have probably already experienced some circumstance or some circumstances in life where maybe you didn't say it, but you might have thought it. "Lord, don't you care?" Well, the disciples posed that question to him, and Jesus responded. And how Jesus responded, I believe, teaches us a couple of things. And what it teaches is this: if and when you say or you are thinking the question, "Lord, don't you care?" that question is rooted in a couple of misguided or faulty notions. The thought, "Lord, don't you care?" the question, "Don't you care about me? Don't you care about my circumstances?" that is rooted in a couple of faulty notions. And the first is this: if your response is not like my response, you don't care. The disciples are coming to Jesus and they say, "Lord, don't you care that we're about to die?" And that question, just like your question or my question, when I say, "Hey, Lord, don't you care what I'm going through?" that question is rooted in this thought: "Lord, if your response is not like my response, that means you don't care. You don't care." Well, how do you see that in this passage? It's pretty simple. This storm is gaining in intensity. Waves are growing in height. The amount of water crashing into the boat is increasing, and all the while Jesus is asleep. As all of this begins, Jesus' absence from the deck was probably not initially noticed. Because, a storm doesn't just start instantly at maximum power. It kind of gradually starts. So the boat begins to bob a little bit more as the wind picks up. And then it continues to pick up. And then the waves get bigger. And then they start beginning bit by bit to crash over. And so the person, when that one wave crashes over, it's no big deal. But when the second one comes, "Hey, we got anything to scoop this out?" And so one disciple joins another, who joins another, who joins another as this continues. And so it didn't happen instantly, but all of a sudden, everybody is kind of pitching in to try to get the water out. Everybody it is on the boat except for Jesus. And finally, and we're not told who it was, but finally, someone notices Jesus isn't with us. You seen Jesus? Last time I saw him, he was asleep. Have you seen Jesus? Well, last time I saw him, he was asleep. And so finally, someone goes to him and wakes him up. And you've got to think that when the question was asked, it was not like this. Lord, do you not care that we are about to die? I mean, you've got to think this is a frantically asked question. Jesus, what is the matter? You're laying here asleep. Do you not care about us? Do you not care that we're going to lose our lives? Sleeping Beauty lying here. All this is going on, and look what's going on with you. Why do they say that to him? The expectation was Jesus should do something. But what did they expect? Candidly, I don't think that they expected what was getting ready to happen. In fact, I think we can say with certainty they did not expect what was getting ready to occur. Because as the passage ends, it says that they were terrified and even perplexed, saying, "Who is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" I don't think they had in a million years the imagination to conceive what was getting ready to happen. And so when they say to Jesus, "Don't you care?" that question is rooted in the expectation that Jesus should be doing something. What do you think they thought he should be doing? At the very least, Jesus ought to be responding to this how they were responding. Maybe that means pitching in and scooping and bailing water out. But at the very least, Jesus ought to have the same emotional response that I'm having. These guys are going around like Chicken Little. The sky is falling. Hey, we're getting ready. We're all goners. We're getting ready to die. The boat's going under. Scared to frantic chaos. I think the expectation was we need to get Jesus in here, and he needs to respond like we do. He needs to respond like we are responding. This needs to be just absolute chaos and utter fear and fright. His response, his emotional response, ought to be just like my response. And when they did not see that, when they did not observe that, the thought was, hey, you do not care. If you have been around church long enough, I feel certain that you have had someone say something like this as part of a worship service. And I get, and let me say at the outset, I understand the thought behind it. But you have probably had someone say, or heard someone say like this. And it may be that they may even stop, take a time out in the worship service and say, you know, that singing was just pathetic. You're sitting here like bumps on a log. You know, here it is, it's Sunday morning, and you're sitting here appearing as though you're watching paint dry. But Friday night, you were out there hollering at the high school football game. You go to a Panthers game and you scream your head off. You go to a basketball game and you go absolutely berserk. And in the scheme of things, none of that stuff matters. But here, we've got an audience with the King of Kings. And what are you doing? No, Friday night, you're hooping, hollering. Does the Lord not deserve some of that? No, nod with me. You've heard something like that probably a time or 10 in your life. Again, I sincerely, I get the thought behind that. But I'll be honest with you, I hate every time somebody says that. Do you know why? I'll tell you why. Do you know what I look like at a ball game that I'm enjoying? Do you know what I look like at a concert that I love every song in it? Do you know what I look like when I am completely engaged in something like that? I look exactly like I look like sitting on the front row over here. My point is this. If someone does not have the same emotive or emotional response as you do, that is not an indicator that they don't care, that they're not engaged, that they've checked out. But sometimes, and I think the disciples here, they're thinking, we're exasperated. We're at our wits' end. We're discombobulated and everything is chaos. And look at Jesus just asleep. He's not responding how I'm responding. He's not all knotted up in an anxious ball of nervousness. He's not any of that. So that says he doesn't care. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. If and when the time comes that you're tempted, based on your circumstances, to look heavenward and say, Lord, don't you care? Bear in mind what I believe Jesus communicates to his disciples here. That question is, first of all, rooted in this notion, albeit a faulty notion, that if your response is not like my response, you do not care. If you're not responding, if you're not feeling how I feel about this, then you don't care. But here's a second faulty notion. That's this. If you do not respond how I want, you do not care. If you do not respond how I want, you do not care. The disciples are in the midst of this chaotic circumstance. Waves are crashing. They are beginning to bail water. When the question is asked, when it is discovered, when it's realized at some point that Jesus is not out on the deck with them, and somebody says, hey, go get him, find out what's going on. When they go to Jesus and they wake him, what do you think the expectation is? The expectation is what? I mean, that we're not told. I believe the expectation is, you need to get out here and get a bucket like the rest of us. And if you're not going to be doing, if you are not responding in terms of action how I want you to, that communicates that you do not care. And candidly, I get that thought. Hopefully you get that thought, because just in the course of relationships with people, let's say you are going through a circumstance and you have someone who has thus far been described by you as a friend, and you are going through some circumstance and you communicate what your need is, what your difficulty is, and when you see them do nothing, when there's no tangible response, what can you do? What conclusion might you arrive at? You may say, well, I thought that was a friend, but clearly it's not. Because a real friend would have done X. Because a real friend cares. A real friend would have done something. But look, I spilled my heart and soul to them. And I've told them how I don't sleep because of all this. And what do they do? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. So if they're not... And what I needed was X. What I was hoping for was X. And they didn't do that. So that says to me that they don't care. What so many times we do is to take that same mentality and then we project it heavenward and say, Lord, if you are not responding how I want you to respond, well, then that communicates that you do not care about me, nor do you care about my circumstances. I remember years ago in Charlotte had a lady that had joined the church, and then a short time later came to me, first through a phone call, and said that the bank was beginning foreclosure proceedings on the house. And I actually saw some of the paperwork, and so that was confirmed. I knew that, they are getting ready to put her out on the street. And long story short, what we did was to the church give enough money to make sure that the foreclosure proceedings stopped. That's what she came to us for. That's what we did. Foreclosure proceedings stopped. I don't know if it was 3 or 4 months later, but she came to me again, and foreclosure proceedings had once again begun. Apparently the last payment that had been made is the one that the church made. And so she comes to me in dire straits, saying, I'm getting ready to lose my house. The bank is going to foreclose. I need some money. I need the church to help me with this. At this point, because it's just been a short time that we have helped, I said, let me let me see some stuff. And so I asked to see some financial records. I asked to see some bank statements. I asked to see her checkbook. And as, for example, I'm looking through her bank statement and checkbook, I see this. And this is just one of them that happens to stand in my mind. I said, I called her name. I said, this check for $100 to the U.S. Olympic Committee. What's that? Well, they called and they were asking for donations. You don't have any money. But as I'm looking at this, I see all of these superfluous, wasteful expenses. And I saw what she came to me, and the expressed need was, what she wanted from me was to give more money. The last thing that she needed was money. What she needed was help and some guidance on how to use what she had. When I offered that, boy, she was ticked. I mean, don't you? I'm going to wind up on the streets. My mom lives here with me. I mean, what's going to happen to us? You don't care anything about us? You don't care anything about the elderly? I was not responding how she wanted me to, and then she used that as pretext to say, no, you do not care. But the truth is, I responded how I did precisely because I did care. I did not want her in another 2 to 3 months getting another statement from Bank of America saying, your house is getting ready to be ours. I cared enough not to give her what she wanted. I cared enough to give her what she needed. But sometimes we'll wave our fists towards heaven in fits of frustration based on our circumstances, and we'll say, Lord, don't you care? And that thought, that question will be rooted in this notion. You're not giving me what I wanted, and so that proves that you do not care. So they've awakened Jesus. And it's interesting what happens. Verse 39 says that Jesus did something. He got up, and then it says that he rebuked the wind. The word that's used there, that's translated as rebuked, you know what it means? It means to rebuke. Well, that's a very accurate translation. To correct, to warn. Let me ask you this. What is it that you can correct or warn? That which is subject to you. That which you are over. And so to this windstorm, and bear in mind, some of these disciples were professional fishermen. I mean, they left boats to follow Jesus in the first place. So that underscores the scope and the scale of this particular storm. They are scared to death. But this massive storm with these massive winds, Jesus rebukes like he's chiding a little child. He rebukes the wind, and then he says to the sea, silence. Honestly, I get Jesus kind of doing it even calmly. Silence. As if to say, that's enough. And instantly, now this storm, it began gradually, but instantly it stops. And the sea is like glass. What I want you to notice, though, is how verse 40 comes to a conclusion. The disciples have come to Jesus with a question, and the question is this, Lord, don't you care? But Jesus has a question himself. He says, why are you so afraid? And then he says this, do you still have what? No faith. No faith. How verse 35 begins when it says, on that day is not accidental. It is important to bear that in mind, to understand what's going on here. On that day. On what day? The same day that all the stuff in chapter 4 is occurring. On this day when he has been teaching in parable after parable after parable. In fact, according to verse 33, it says he was speaking the word to them with many parables like these as they were able to understand. Verse 34, he did not, however, speak to the disciples without a parable. Privately, however, he explained everything to them. So not only are they getting the illustrations, they're getting this private time where Jesus explains and fleshes out everything. So on the day where that is occurring, on the day where Jesus describes the kingdom of God and the gospel going out like a sower casting seed, and there's rocky ground, and there's wayside, and there's soft ground, fertile ground, there's weedy soil. His faith likens the gospel experience to that. And then he continues by talking about your faith, once received, operating like a light, that you don't cover it up and put under a bushel. You put it on a lampstand like you would in a home to expel as much darkness as possible, that faith once received should be broadcast. But then he talks in verse 26 about the kingdom of God, and he says it's like a growing seed. And then verse 30 talks about the parable of the mustard seed and likens the kingdom of God and the experience of becoming a part of God's family and experiencing salvation like a little tiny mustard seed that's so tiny, so small, becomes something so great, that something so little can be so consequential. It is not in this passage that this occurs, but Matthew and Luke describe it, where Jesus says something you're probably familiar with. He said, if only you had faith as small as what? A mustard seed. And here, 3 times, 4 times he's talking about seed, and twice likening the kingdom of God to a mustard seed. In Matthew and Luke, he said, if you had the faith of a mustard seed, you could even speak to the mountain and it would move. Sometimes people have gotten that so distorted, and there's people you can turn the TV on today that will twist and torment what Jesus said to conform it into something that he did not communicate at all. Some hucksters would say that, you need faith so that you can speak to your empty checkbook and money will appear in it. Divine favor comes. You can speak to that empty billfold and money shows up. You can speak to that achy knee, and if you got enough faith, then if faith of a mustard seed can... That's not what Jesus was talking about. The goal was not the focus on faith, but rather the object of faith. And the goal was not to say, well, if you just have more faith, then great things can be done. He was talking about the power of and the amazing potential of just a little bit of faith. Bear that in mind as you consider his question here to the disciples. Guys, you still have 0. 0. Not only is it that they have experienced what you read in chapter 4 with those parables. You go back to chapter 1, in verse 21, Jesus is casting out a demon. In verse 29 of chapter 1, Jesus heals the mother of Simon and Andrew. And not only does that, but he casts out other demons and heals a stack of other people in the town where she lives. There's a leper who is cleansed at the end of chapter 1. He heals many at the beginning of chapter 2. As chapter 3 begins, he is calling more disciples, and by chapter 4, he's beginning to unpack all of these parables. Long story short, the disciples have had a track record of experience now with Jesus, where they have seen him repeatedly do that which can only be described as miraculous. They have seen him take a guy who had a withered limb, and all of a sudden, instantly, he's got a perfectly normal, fully grown, fully developed limb. A guy who has been in a leper colony for an unknown period of time, as a societal outcast who is physically experiencing a disease that could cause literally his limbs to fall off, and Jesus makes him whole and well. That Simon and Andrew's mother, potentially she was maybe even on her deathbed when Jesus speaks healing to her, and she is made whole and well. They've had all of that. They have had all of this teaching of Jesus, not simply in parables and illustrations, but fleshed out teaching. And still they come to Jesus with the question, what? Don't you care? And Jesus' response was what? You still don't have faith? After everything that's been afforded you, you still don't have faith to trust me, even when you don't know what the next corner is going to hold? You still don't know that I have the ability to do whatever I want, that it's going to be in the ultimate best interests of people? You've seen me do all of these things, not simply for others, but even for you. Have I not proven the depth of my care and concern and compassion for you? And yet, still, no faith. No faith. At the end of the day, the question asked of Jesus, Lord, don't you care, is a question that was rooted in an absence of faith. Where faith is present, even just a little bit, there is this confidence: whatever He does, whenever He does it, however He does it, will be for my ultimate good, because He cares for me. Frank Graff, the hymn writer, wrote it this way: oh yes, He cares. I know He cares. His heart is touched with my grief. Does He care? You bet He does. The question is, do you have faith in who He is? Will you bow your heads with me? Jesus was looking toward His disciples, expecting that what they had been exposed to, not only in terms of teaching and in truth, but what they had observed by His demonstration of power, that even when the circumstances are unsettling, even when the circumstances are frightful, those circumstances can be gone through with the confidence Jesus knows. And whatever He is going to do, whatever He is doing, is for my ultimate good. Even if I can't see it, even if I don't know what the big picture is. And so, there's a lot that I don't understand. There's a lot that I haven't figured out. He didn't ask for a lot of faith, just a little bit. Because a little bit is enough to lead me to say, Lord, I trust You. Does God see that type of response from you in your heart? Maybe what you're going through right now feels like a storm. Maybe waves are crashing in, and to the extent that the metaphor holds true, it's like you've been trying to shake heaven and say, Lord, don't You care? And the Lord's trying to say, oh yes, I do. I'm not giving you what you want. I'm giving you what you need. I'm at work even though it seems as though I'm indifferent, but I'm not. Because I have a goal of seeing you depend on. I have a goal of seeing you truly trust me and who I am. Do you need to talk to the Lord about that this morning? Maybe it is right where you are. Maybe it is kneeling at this altar. Maybe you want the help of someone else. Maybe you want my help just to pray with you this morning. Whatever it is, I believe that God wants us to be impacted and affected by what He's shared for us. Maybe this morning it is God tugging at your heart to say, listen, you don't know me in a real and a personal way. You know stuff about me, but you don't know me personally. And you want someone to help you with that. Please, whether it's during this time of invitation or when this service is over, find me, find Shep, find one of us to be able to share with you how you can experience a relationship with Christ, that even a small amount of faith, it can do great and amazing things. Maybe this is the day that God's leading you to connect formally with Gate City. Maybe there's just a burden you want to leave at this altar. I just believe God speaks because He wants us to respond. Lord, thank You for Your word